Hello, and welcome to the second of our Soundscapes in the Early Modern World research seminars. As probably many of you know by now, I'm Rachel Willie, one of the lead investigators on the Soundscapes project, along with Emily Murphy, who is hiding in the chat somewhere. It gives me really great pleasure to introduce Niall Atkinson today. I'll keep my comments about him brief because I know that you want to listen to him talk and not me. So Niall is Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Chicago, and his teaching and scholarship very much focuses on public space, urban history, soundscapes, geography and travel, as well as architecture and urbanism of late medieval and Renaissance Italy. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with his The Noisy Renaissance, Sound Architecture in Florentine Urban Life, which came out with Pennsylvania State University Press in 2016. Today he's going to talk on the sonic renaissance, bodily experience and spatial history. Oh, I should also actually give a few sort of housekeeping points before we begin. So please, chat away enthusiastically on the chat. Recording of this will be available on the Society of Renaissance Studies Crowdcast channel after the event, and we're very grateful to the SRS for hosting it. And we'll also put a recording of it onto the Soundscapes project website. If you have any questions, do personally ask a question button box, which is just to the left of the chat pane, and we can read them out to Niall, or if you would like to come on screen and ask your question, then do say so, and type so, and we can invite you on screen. It's best to have headphones at the ready if you're going to do that, to make sure that we don't get some interesting experimental music. Though, since we're in the business of soundscapes, the experimental music might be something which is fun, who knows. Anyway, so I'll pass you now over to Niall, and yes, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you all of you for coming. It's really, really fantastic to see so many familiar names. I would like to thank Rachel and Emily, as well as Alex Fisher, who I know is here, for having included me from time over the years in this larger project of early modern soundscapes, of which I'm really honored to have participated in. I remember fondly our time in Vancouver, which is the only time I've ever visited that city in my own country, several years ago. And so I'm very, very happy to share this material with you this evening. It revisits some familiar text that I have been working on, but it's I'm working on trying to develop a new direction in the research on acoustics and bodily experience in the Middle Ages and Renaissance in Italy. So let me share my screen with you quickly. Okay, and I will now begin. Let's see if this works. Great. Okay. In this paper, I'd like to look at how various historical voices, literary, metaphorical, represented, real, imagined, facilitate our historical understanding of architecture and urban space in late medieval and Renaissance Italy. And just so you know, this is one of the most architecturally explicit papers that I've given in a long while. I would like to do this through two key texts that were produced in Florence in the 14th century. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, completed toward 1352, and Franco Secchetti's In Trecento Novelle, written largely in the final decade of the 14th century. Both of these texts respond explicitly to urban crises by proposing to tell stories. However, in order to confront the cultural loss and social anxiety produced, they deploy different narrative strategies to facilitate this understanding through a literary discourse that confronted the city not as an object to behold, but as a problem to be posed. Such an approach assumes that the act of storytelling embodied a critical mechanism that participated in the construction of symbolic spaces in the Renaissance. In the wake of the 1348 plague, Boccaccio sets up a rigid narrative structure in the Decameron in which both the time and space of storytelling are tightly contained. He constructs an elaborate system of frames which demarcate a chain of narratives enclosed within each other. In the Trecento Novelle, a work that explicitly sets itself in dialogue with the Decameron, however, Secchetti's stories immerse themselves in the ebb and flow of daily urban life. Just as Boccaccio claimed to offer his stories as solace to love-struck women, Sacchetti confronts profound social insecurities of war, pestilence, and family ruin with comforting and pleasing stories. They both, however, set the therapeutic power of the storyteller's voice against the edge of sickness and death, transforming the pleasure of the stories into ironic, ambiguous, but ultimately ethical responses to social anxiety. Before entering into the text, however, I would like to locate the sonic renaissance in relationship between space and representation, or more specifically, the relationship between architecture and storytelling. So let me start with some architectural theory. I've argued elsewhere that Italian travelers from at least the 14th century developed a mode of describing foreign cities that was then codified by the 15th century intellectual, humanist, and self-styled expert on pretty much everything, Leon Battista Alberti. Alberti's treatise on architecture was the first Western example of the genre since antiquity, and in it, he defined what he determined to be the whole matter of building, which consisted of 6 constituent parts: locality, area, compartition, wall, roof, and opening. Locality, Alberti defined as the topographical context in which the site of a prospective building or city was set. Area was that part of the locality that was the plot of land defined and enclosed by walls, including all those routes through which the body could move. Compartition was the layout or process of dividing up the site into all of its constituent parts, which were joined together like parts of the body. Walls, roofs, and openings, respectively, were the elements that defined privacy, protection, and access. Alberti's elements were not only a rational trajectory from external context to internal structures, they were based on the way one encountered architectural environments in motion. Alberti's elements were not only a rational trajectory from external context to internal structures, they were based on the way in which one encountered architectural environments in motion by the synchronized movements of a wandering body, a wandering eye, and a listening ear. Alberti was writing about the process of good design principles, but his succession from regional setting to individual building interiors was the pattern and order that contemporary travel accounts consistently applied to the description and analysis of unfamiliar cities, such as this Cairo, and the populations they housed. These elements defined the successive frames that architecture constructed to mediate between polarities that it was responsible for creating in the first place, between the outside and the inside, between the natural and the urban, between the country and the city, between the public and the private, to name the most obvious. Cities were, in this definition, more complex macrocosms of individual buildings, just as families were, or ought to be, microcosms of the city's administration in Alberti's universe. And the task of good design was the smooth regulation of the thresholds between each successive architectural order, ring, or frame. In other words, fewer and fewer people had access to the increasingly private and singular spaces of the city: bedrooms, private chapels, government meeting rooms, etc., based on their current status, familiar relationships, gender, or labor. I'm showing you this overlay of the medieval Sultan's Palace in Cairo, because it was there are several descriptions of Italian travelers in the 14th and 15th century who described the successive gates that one continually went through to the more interior, more private, restricted spaces until they eventually were allowed to the audience hall of the Sultan himself. A well-designed city, such thresholds work seamlessly to facilitate or bar access in both directions between its interior and exterior spaces. For our purposes, properly designed walls provided the relative acoustic privacy and amplification of sound so that effective communication was possible, while windows allowed those inside to be able to safely see and hear at a distance the goings-on of the world outside. In effect, architecture in the Renaissance created space by enclosing it and subdividing it in order to reproduce, facilitate, or reify social relations that were then defined spatially. Storytelling, too, also created space and its acoustic effects, modulated and distorted it, enhanced its beauty, and confused its logical order. If urban legislation read out in council halls, redacted in texts, and promulgated in the streets established a legal framework for urban spaces, then human movement, the urban soundscape, and civic narratives participated in the construction, experience, and interpretation of those spaces. They distorted and made it strange, redesigned it to test its limits, and reorganized its hierarchies. Their ephemeral interventions into the form and structure of buildings and communities makes them critical sources for a spatial historical investigation. According to the sociologist Georg Simmel, a frame or border that surrounds a social group has an analogous function to the frame of a work of art. It closes the group off from the surrounding world, while at the same time it holds that group together, protecting its integrity. The architecture of the Decameron. A city's walls performed a similar function. Although, like any structure or social group, there needed to be a mechanism that controlled what and how things crossed this threshold, all the while maintaining such a distinct identity and border. Within these walls, laws and regulations created internal thresholds between groups and individuals. Such an obsession with thresholds also drives the logic of the Decameron and its insistent narrative frames, a work of art that requires a whole system of internal structures and borders in order to play out its drama. It interrogates the divisions between city and country, squares and public buildings, streets and private homes, the very things that were on minds of contemporary city planners. And here I'm showing you a reconstruction, like an elaboration of an idea first proposed by Franco Fido about the ground plan of the Decameron. The Decameron's structural framework, I'll have more to say about this. Its structural framework is best understood as an architectural ground plan. The recent plague of 1348 had severely undermined the carefully constructed borders that organized Florentine urban space and society. It was against this incomprehensible tragedy that Boccaccio's text assembles an elaborate and rigid architectonic narrative armature to preserve the space of storytelling as an archive of urban memory. This was necessary in my view because the breakdown of a city's social structures or its architectural structures necessarily compromised the integrity of the other, and that was prominently on display in Boccaccio's eyewitness description of the destructive forces of the bubonic plague. But before we follow that path, let me set up the Decameron's spatial organization, which was for some readers its most fascinating attribute. And in fact, there is a copy, an amateur transcription of the Decameron from the 14th century that gets rid of the entire content of the stories and only reproduces in textual form these frames, the architectural threshold that I'm outlining right now. As Lucia Battagliorici has pointed out, the Decameron is explicit about where it starts and where it ends. It begins in the earliest 14th century manuscript in red, like this. Here begins the book called the Decameron, and it ends like this. Here ends the 10th and last day of the book called Decameron. Its diagrammatic organization merges seamlessly with the experimental designs of ideal cities in the Renaissance, such as this rendering of the architect and theorist Filaretti's ideal city from his 15th century treatise, with its similar concentric structure through which visitors would move from external walls to the spatial hierarchy, through the spatial hierarchy of the city to its carefully guarded political center. Readers of the Decameron entered the work as they would a walled city, traversing the thresholds to its inner spaces. In each day of storytelling, they are guided in and out of the Brigata's world, the group of storytellers. But early readers of the Decameron could, and they did, insistently, zoom out to take account of the entire landscape and setting of the Decameron, taking in a clear view of its spatial logic. In other words, this is a text they were constantly working on as if they were constantly redesigning the world around them. But it seems to work like this. And I'm going to try and explain this diagram here. Standing outside the structure is the author, whose voice gives shape to the outer frame, addressing readers on the opposing side in the eternal present. Within this outer frame, the narrator's voice takes charge by addressing the work's fictional readers, all those contemporary women who found themselves locked in their bedrooms with no outlet for their social desires, and for whom these stories would offer them tools to imagine ways of crossing the thresholds of the city that were forbidden to them. We can see this dramatized visually in this image, again, from the earliest extant manuscript of the Decameron. And I apologize here for the resolution issue or the unfocused issue. I took this picture myself. It's a very tiny image, and I don't think I'll be allowed back ever to look at this manuscript again. So this is all I have. We can see in this dramatized, visually in this image from the Decameron. Sitting at a lectern, the narrator is depicted in the act of storytelling, addressing a gathering of attentive women rather than male students. However, something significant has happened. The architectural barriers described in the text, all those locked bedrooms that trapped women within a soul-destroying idleness across the mercantile city, have disappeared in this image. It is as if the act of storytelling itself, the desire to narrate to a specific audience, has transported the author from his writing desk, gained him access to those closed spaces, and brought that audience into being in what looks like a university seminar in the Middle Ages. Immediately, the text-image relationship foreshadows the trope of how architectural barriers are set up to mediate, foreclose, maintain, and preempt the desiring voice that seeks incessantly to dissolve those very barriers. This is the first interior space of the work, where the narrator also introduces the so-called Brigata, a group of 10 men and women who have fled the plague-stricken city to spend 10 days in the abandoned countryside around Florence. There they govern the next interior frame as narrators of their own stories, told to each other over 10 days, creating space for the 100 stories that occupy the next interior zone, the actual stories or novellas themselves. And then within those stories told lie other narrators of internal stories and all the lies, tricks, games, and collective memory of a deep past that had to be preserved at all costs at the center of this structure from the deadly pandemic that was threatening the world of the Brigata and had traumatized the real world of the author. This construction encourages a certain type of non-linear reading and conceives of the text more as a place to explore rather than a story to successfully unfolds. Inside, as each interior space becomes more and more porous, and I've already indicated this with this very simple, these dotted lines, for example. The contents of these spaces, the stories themselves, can be shuffled about, taken apart, and rearranged safely, which is exactly what readers did to the Decameron. Writers, both professionals and amateurs, continually rewrote, took apart, and reassembled the stories in the Decameron, while its outer structural frame protected a dispersed cultural memory that the plague threatened to obliterate. To literally render its society silent by building a monument whose structure sealed off its own doors to withstand such an assault. So the Decameron was designed to function much like a pre-modern city. Its protective walls were endlessly surveilled by the presence of its authorial voice. Inside, its inhabitants structured their own social relations according to certain notions of moral order. Members of the Brigata each took a turn in governing the others while setting the rules for their physical and social well-being. Waking, dancing, dining, strolling, singing, storytelling, and sleeping, which is pretty much what they're doing there. This allowed for a certain amount of freedom to experiment in upending the social order they had known, questioning authority, pursuing one's desires, and transgressing both spatial and narrative thresholds through social discourse, much as the organization of cities allowed for certain spaces of moral, political, and social transgression in certain zones and at certain times, such as during carnival, in taverns, and private homes. Now, what does this have to do with sound or the sonic renaissance? I would answer by making the claim that it was sound itself, both real and figurative, the stories told and heard, that played a crucial role in defining, highlighting, hence obscuring, and impairing the structural integrity of architecture in ways that did not, by and large, physically destroy the built environment. Inside, the sounds in and of the stories that city dwellers told to and about themselves laid bare the cultural meaning of buildings and spaces. As an architectural historian, I see this as a way to build a spatial history at the intersection of the body's relationship to sound and architecture. So I hope that the following reveals some of the ways in which this plays out in stories found inside and outside the Decameron. Let me start Within the first interior frame of the work, a space that the reader is brought to by the narrator at the beginning and end of each day. So we're moving in and out between these thresholds. This space is in which the voice of the narrator has succeeded in breaching the walls that confine his imagined female audience. On day one, the narrator also tells us that there is no way to cross the threshold into the interior stories themselves unless we follow the narrator through the horrific description of the plague itself. So the journey has to go through this catastrophe in order to get to those stories inside, which, of course, the plague being told is a disturbing metaphor of architectural failure in acoustic terms. And I think this is crucial. After a graphic description of the human and animal suffering caused by the plague and the consequent breakdown of the city's institutions, the narrator contrasts the opposing ways in which Florentines responded to the crisis. Both revolve around the relative opacity and porosity of the fundamental architectural frame, or wall, and its threshold, the door or window. In the first instance, people locked themselves up within houses that were plague-free and lived a moderate but elegant lifestyle. They shut themselves off from the world of terror around them so that not even the stories of the horrible events outside were allowed to seep through the walls and contaminate the closed acoustic space of their self-imposed quarantine, as they attempted to drown out such noise with their own pleasurable sounds. They denied any link to the rest of the city as they reduced their world to a tiny interior space, even more inaccessible, it was hoped, than any woman's bedroom. The other response was quite the opposite. It involved a conscious attitude of abandon, drinking in excess, and satisfying one's appetites. These people caroused in abandoned houses whose doors now lay wide open for anyone to come and go. In these spaces, domestic thresholds had been permanently transgressed. Doors no longer fulfilled their proper function in the absence of the families that gave them meaning. In a functioning urban environment, entrances and exits were carefully controlled, property lines were clearly demarcated, and goods were bought and sold in their proper places. All of the meticulous ways in which architecture organized urban social relations were now unraveling into chaos and oblivion. This breakdown clearly decimated the physical framework that structured social life. In the first case, Florentines tried to make the architectural frame impenetrable to the immersive qualities of sound, where even hearing bad news brought the terrifying threat of disease and infection. In the second case, the wall was abandoned as acoustic protection, and with doors wide open, the raucous sound of wanton abandon could be heard across a terrified city. Between these two reactions to the plague, we encountered the two extremes of the wall as a boundary. Boccaccio has set up these two extremes as architectural dysfunction, absolute containment and absolute dissolution, in which architecture itself disappeared as a system facilitating social mediation. In its place, Boccaccio offers his literary architectural monument that stands between the world falling apart and the world within, in which this monument provides the spaces for the relative free play of readers to reflect upon their own physical, moral, social, and political relationships to the walls that enclose them, or that used to enclose them, the barriers that used to protect them, and the thresholds that separated them. This breach of the architectural barrier is a central theme of the Decameron, and it rests on a tripartite construction. From the voice of the narrator, whose tales transport him into the domestic interiors of his female audience, through the tragedy of those very same walls torn asunder by the havoc of the plague, to the often comic and farcical breaches of barriers in many of the stories that follow, in which sound plays a central role in opening up spaces to desire. As an ethical move, the Decameron questions various aspects of the architectural frame in order to determine what might be worth saving, what could be better designed in light of the destruction of so many arbitrary socio-spatial relations. I'm just showing you this image again from the same early manuscript that has an argument has been made that these are Boccaccio's own drawings based on some comparative analysis with doodles in his own autographed manuscripts, but also because of the way in which they are very, very intuitive in illustrating the kind of nuances of the stories, which is not true for most of the illustrated versions of the Decameron into the 15th, 16th centuries. Here we see on the left the hovering figure of death over corpses that have all assumedly died from the plague. And then you have an interior bedroom, right, that has been completely dislocated from its interior space. The walls have been dissolved, and there are two servants attending to what appears to be a sick and dying mistress. And then on the right, you have again then a funeral cortege, which bodies are being brought to mass graves. So you see the way in which death and interior space are now coexisting in ways in which they aren't supposed to in a well-functioning state. Okay, so what follows, I'd like to trace narrative threads within these two texts that engage directly with the experience of urban space and architecture. Boccaccio's stories focus on how architecture defines and reinforces the closed parameters of domestic space, while those of Sacchetti continually return to the problem of the open, unruly spaces of the city. In the Decameron, for example, the narrative drive of telling of certain stories hinges upon the ability of characters to carefully modulate their voices and to hear across thresholds as a means of rearranging their surroundings to suit personal desires. In the Trecento Novelle, the city emerges as a dominant character itself, confronting its inhabitants with a volatile, cacophonous, and implacable field that constantly impedes and undermines social communication. In both, the city is not simply a backdrop upon which scenes play themselves out. It is instead a series of overlapping topographies full of noise and confusion, its spaces buzzing with fake energy. Brought to life by the diverse human activities that surround and invade it, stories spill down its streets and into its squares. The city itself swells and resists, barging noisily into the chaos of daily life. In both works, the architectural matrix is not simply a backdrop upon which the scenes play themselves out. I think I just said that. I apologize. It is instead a physical medium that has to be worked on, taken apart, and then reordered. Sacchetti often focuses on the opacity of urban space as a dramatic mechanism, while for Boccaccio, the spatial issue is often the relative porosity of walls. Both authors explore aspects of the contemporary spatial imagination in which architecture and urban space are linked directly to the desire and interaction of the body as a social phenomenon. So in order to show what I mean, let me begin with spatial dimensions of the Decameron. Within the spaces inhabited by the Beata, which amount to abandoned villas in the countryside around Florence, storytellers explore ways of rebuilding the architectural frame that destroyed by the plague, interrogating the arbitrariness of dividing up space. Success and resolution for characters in the Decameron often require that they manipulate a physical medium. They have to surmount barriers placed between themselves and the thing they want to possess. Characters have to figure out the vocal key that opens the door to a potential lover's heart, but they also have to demonstrate the mental and physical agility to traverse urban spaces and pass through walls in unconventional ways. In short, they have to redesign the urban environment by making holes in its walls, turning windows into doors, balconies into bedrooms, bedrooms into spaces of fulfillment. Okay, third story, third day. Spatial knowledge also requires that one tailor one's speech to one's environment in order to produce the desired effect. In this story, a woman seeks a lover of true quality because she despises her rich but undeserving husband. In order to get the message to her prospective lover, she has to modulate or even deform the content of her speech so that it passes through the medium of a trusting but oblivious friar, whom you see in this 15th century manuscript. It has to pass through him without losing its intended meaning. The story she tells the friar is a falsehood whose believability hinges on a masculine social anxiety about the threat of male lovers penetrating the closed space of matrimony. Such an anxiety underlies the relationships around doorways and female bodies. She describes a scene, the wife does, therefore, in which her honor is accosted by the lover she hopes to procure, and she addresses this complaint to the friar. So what she's doing is she knows that, So she knows that the friar is going to react to her complaints about someone harassing her in the streets sexually by going to that person and chastising him, and then that person will know, because he has no idea what he's talking about. He will know that this is actually exactly what the woman wants him to do, and so it's a way to get the message through the meeting with the friar out into the street of the male potential lover, so that he knows that what actions are called for. The friar, however, is deaf to the actual intent of the message, which makes him a perfect medium for delivering it to its intended object. The lever you see in the center and off to the right, this is a sequential image here. You can see that there he's telling in the middle the lever, and then the lever knows he has to climb the tree up into her bedroom. The latter perfectly understands the actions you must take, which are exactly those laid out by the unwitting friar. The message, therefore, arrives in an unadulterated form, a product of the desire or fantasy of linguistic transparency. Through a series of messages, the woman constructs a story of courtship that the man will then act out. This story within the story concludes when the lover, on instructions from the friar, climbs the tree outside her window and enters into her waiting arms. The woman understands the way that female messages travel in space, and that if not uttered carefully, could lead to unwanted results. In fact, she'd avoided appealing to her brothers for help because, as she tells the friar, men's messages often provoke terrible responses. Their words inevitably lead to deeds, and usually violent ones. Okay, fifth story of the seventh day. Separating women from the hazards of daily contact in the social world provides the basis for an architecture of anxiety in this story, where a rabidly jealous husband sequesters his wife within her room. His irrational state, however, sets the stage for the very thing he is trying to avoid. This unnamed woman is unable to unlock her bedroom door and is also denied visual access to the street from her window. And of course, as a story told by Boccaccio's narrator, her thoughts then naturally in this environment turn towards love and sex. She remembered that there was a handsome man who lived next door to her, and thinks to herself that if only there were a hole in the wall, she would be able to contact him and send him her love. So she carefully searches the wall that separates them. So this is a party wall that separates two apartments, detecting the slightest chink in its blank surface, which she transforms into a hole. By doing so, she transforms this wall between the households into a porous membrane that is susceptible to her desire. Not unlike language, walls too contain gaps and slips that allow a user to make certain modifications in structure. Holding hands through this hole with her lover, however, fails to fully satisfy her, so she resolves to play a game of storytelling, will turn the enclosed domestic architecture against itself. She brings this about by telling her husband a story in which he is the protagonist that enters her room every night and sleeps with her. However, since her husband hears the story disguised as the woman's confessor because he doesn't trust her, he misinterprets it, believing that the priest that she's talking about, who has the power to open all the doors of her house simply by speaking, must be her lover, forgetting that he's dressed as a priest. This magical door-opening ability of the priest husband is in stark contrast to the slow, arduous task of the wife, who must manage with the tiniest hole in the wall. However, Boccaccio shows how the power to tell effective stories relies on anticipating and the presuppositions of one's audience. Meaning is content-specific, and the ability to interpret properly is a critical skill. The husband believes the story, but his interpretation, flawed by his jealousy, leads precisely to the very conditions in which these fears will come true. At night, he constrains his wife behind a series of 3 locked doors: her bedroom, the landing, and the front door of the house. However, as he will soon discover, he has only succeeded in locking himself out and allowing his wife to turn the prison-like series of doors and thresholds into a sanctuary of desire. Her lover, of course, climbs over the roof and enters the window into her waiting arms. And you can see the pattern developing here. The art of opening and closing doors is a gendered act in which the power of the male character has a magical effect. But architecture can also be rendered porous to a woman who can give voice to the story of her desires. In this case, the woman finds sexual satisfaction within a functioning matrimonial bond and within a spatial framework that defines the limits of that bond. The holes she has made in the wall, however, lead only to other interior erotic spaces, and they end with the masculine figure of the lover. There is, as of yet, no space beyond that could lead her out into the streets effectively. So let me turn to Sacchetti and Finding a Voice in his novella 201. While the Decameron's heroines can send messages through servants across urban spaces, they rarely venture out into the streets. Streets were noisy and unpredictable places, especially for women. Sacchetti writes that out there, women were like lambs among wolves. Ordinary discourse does not function well in the chaotic spaces of the Trecento novelle, but there are ways in which characters can manipulate spatial symbolic systems. In novella 201, Madonna Cecchina, the widow of a relatively wealthy merchant, is gradually wrested of nearly all her possessions by the powerful citizens of Modena. She had no recourse to the law, but she formulates a plan in which she would appropriate the visual language of the street in order for her case to finally be heard. She organizes a procession in which a friend holds one fish inside the mouth of another while her son bangs on a bell. As this mock procession of relics wends its way through the city, to anyone who asked what it meant, Cecchina would simply answer, "It is the big fish who eat the little ones." This composition of fish, accompanied by a single utterance, created a kind of exemplum that had to be interpreted by those who heard it. Unlike many of the women in the Decameron, Madonna Cecchina is caught within the open spaces of the city, where women do not have access to intimate manipulations of speech, the way a wife has alone with her husband or in the confession box. The street presents an own mechanism of spatial constrictions. This forces Cecchina to appropriate a conventional language that preceded her, the language of the exemplum, the language of the procession, and which belongs to the urban environment itself. However, the lords of the city refuse to interpret the message, and our narrator assures us that, quote, "Those who allow widows and children to be wronged will soon lose their power, as the lords of Modena did shortly after this to a much bigger fish. Name was Gonzaga." Okay, communication breakdown, novella 159. Sacchetti's novellas, I'm sorry. Okay, so I'll let that go there. Okay. Sacchetti's novellas return time and again to the problem of communication in urban spaces, which are often the site of garbled messages and misquotations, the stage of continual breakdown in social interaction. The narrator mocks the communal atmosphere of paranoia and chastises a political class who, everywhere it looked, saw conspiracy and threats. In novella 159, Sacchetti revisits the theme of misrecognizing urban chaos, this time best in the language of urban revolt. In farcical fury, an old horse chases a mare from the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore in Florence to the city's main market, the Mercato Vecchio. The merchants, mistaking equine love for political insurrection, begin the ritual closing up of their shops. As the horses run down the Calimala, the cloth merchants are also already throwing their wares inside and looking up. There is now a large crowd following as the horses enter the city's grain market, where they cause havoc among the grain dealers, and the blind who would gather there at the pillars of the arcade, being knocked about and chafed in the confusion, begin lashing about them with their sticks. It would not be long before a full-scale brawl would break out. It is then, no surprise, that this is when this pulsing mass of bodies arrives at the city's main political square, the Piazza della Signoria, where government officials in absolute terror lock up the palace and arm their guards. When they saw that the confusion had finally subsided, the city's military and judicial authorities, the Capitano and the Podestà, mount their horses and rush into the square to bring back order, only to receive insult and abuse by those who had remained there. The story ends with the lone figure of the executor of justice, who, now 2 hours after the event, had managed to summon up the courage to come out of the cupboard where he was hiding, shake out the mice nesting in his helmet, put on his uniform full of cobwebs, and mount his horse, only to lurch helplessly around the almost empty square, where those remaining simply tell him to go home. The brilliance of this story is the way it narrates the increasing spatial sweep of sonic pandemonium as the crowd swells into a critical mass that suddenly deflates into a stinging parody of urban politics and an ambivalent representation of the misplaced power of collective action to topple nervous regimes. As an incisive and engaged reader of Boccaccio, Sacchetti embraced the Decameron as an urban dialogue that found its immediate audience in the merchant classes. According to Vittore Branca, it inspired in them a happy confidence and familiarity that permitted endless reworkings, suppressions, and insertions of the text, of which Sacchetti's was a singular example. He cautions us that the public domain is a tendentious medium filled with disparate voices which exert uncontrollable influence over the stories let loose there. However, although the Decameron may have been subject to this fragmentation, its architectonic structure was an attempt to fortify it against just such social dissolution and to allow this play. The Brigatta's rigid daily regimen and regular storytelling over 10 days away from the chaos of the plague-ridden city was an act of temporary preservation, not unlike the removal of works of art from the city in times of war. In doing so, they gathered together a dispersed cultural memory that the plague threatened to obliterate, and built a monument whose structure sealed off its own doors in order to withstand such an assault. Within, the work maintained and promoted experiments in storytelling as a defense against disappearance. This architectural edifice was built to contain memories of a past and to provide a space apart that allowed the process of rebuilding to take form. When the Brigata returned to Florence at the end of the Decameron, its structural form could then be subject to numerous rewritings and reelaborations that copied, took apart, reassembled, and retold those stories in the very urban milieu that they had so vividly represented and preserved from total ruin. Sacchetti's work was part of that rebuilding scheme, a complex, often playful, sometimes violent, but always hopeful series of reflections and distortions, somewhere inside of which were ethically motivated questions about the nature of streets and squares, the function of walls and doors, all a product of engaged urban subjects who never ceased from voicing their desire to recreate, reinterpret, and rejuvenate all those recalcitrant and intractable walls that surrounded them. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a very rich and such a brilliant paper. I mean, I was reminded of Frida Misfelder's review of your Noisy Renaissance, where he talks about the way in which it cuts through traditional disciplinary boundaries, walls, gaps, and slips. And this is yet another example of that in terms of the ways in which you so effortlessly move across various kind of traditional boundaries in terms of disciplines. We do have a few moments for questions. If anyone has any that they would like to post. Oh, I think everyone's too busy enthusiastically commenting upon your paper, Neil, at the moment.
That's really nice to see.
Yeah, I mean, I think something which I was very much struck by when you were giving the example of the chink in the wall and the woman who was, you know, trying to be kept behind doors by her husband. But I was also kind of wondering about the relationship perhaps between, I guess, biblical narrative and the idea of women as leaky vessels, and whether there's a kind of connection between the leaky vessel of the bodies and the leakiness of the architectural space as well.
Wow, that's fascinating. I think it's going to take more time than we have here to think about that. But let me just address just what first comes to mind. Leaky vessels, definitely. And I don't know this tradition, but I can just sort of speak to the kind of I think it's true throughout. It's a kind of facile relationship between the architectural interior and the female womb, right? And the kinds of secretions that the female body is subject to, and the ways in which architecture there's a constant anxiety about, and I think lack of understanding the ways in which buildings are actually leaking. This is a constant practical problem today, like in architectural design as well. That they need to allow these kind of they need to act as a kind of valves, right? I mean, this is the way in which Michael Camille talked about the gates of the medieval city. They're supposed to let stuff out, but not stuff in. You know, the way in which valves work, and so that leakiness is dysfunction. And so that, I mean, from my, just from what you said, this would then enhance the ways in which the female body is flawed, right, and slightly badly designed, right, as both a container and a producer in engaging with the world.
Okay, brilliant, wonderful, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the whole I love the idea of the way in which sound moves in and out of architecture and the voice of the narrator, and the way that you connected all this to storytelling. Now we have a question from Emily Murphy. Find fifth story fascinating, how the priest was assumed to be the lover because of the power of his voice. I wondered if you could dwell more on this. Is there something broader here about Renaissance Florence and the priest's vocal powers, and especially about priests crossing thresholds inappropriately?
Oh, that's a great question. I haven't actually thought of it, and now I'm embarrassed that I haven't. But it's absolutely. I think you hit upon something there that that was implicit in some of the stories I'm interested in, and that is, yes, there is often a friar and or a priest whose access to the bedroom of the female is sort of privileged. I think it's partly because of who they are and the fact that they were among the few men who are allowed to be alone with women, even because I mean they're a large, long steady practice of confessing of wealthy women at their own home, which of course in Counter Reformation became a real no-no, and so there's a critique of that. But yes, I think that and the power of his voice, which of course is connected to the absolution of sins, but also then and its power to therefore penetrate right into the interior of the female body where that sin is, where the leaks come out, and the kind of desire or sort of sexual desire that is maybe implicit within the power of that voice to penetrate, as I'm thinking through your question, which is great. Because, yeah, and in several of those images that you saw, it is a religious, right? So someone who's ordained who is listening behind a door, too. So I think that they're that they have that the fact that they may also claim to listen to the word of God or hear the word of God in a privileged way might also be connected to this critique that Boccaccio is performing constantly on religious figures like this, and by turning it into sexual desire or connecting it to sexual desire. So I think that and I think that a readership in the 14th century would be very much aware of those vocal relationships because of the ways in which registers of the voice from preaching, sermons, confession were understood on a kind of daily basis versus the kinds of strictures put upon women, not only just even to make sound, but to the kinds of sounds they could actually utter at certain moments. It's interesting in this case, I'm not sure how that might connect, but in one of these stories in which the husband is trying, in that story I told, the husband tries to distort his voice with rocks in his mouth so she doesn't recognize it. So there's a kind of anxiety there too, but the fact that he actually doesn't have the vocal power he needs and is trying to disguise it desperately. Of course, she sees or hears right through it.
Wonderful, thank you. And yes, I guess there's the issue of why women's silence and how women's silence also relates to this. We have a question from Alex Fisher. I love the focus on storytelling in architecture. You're not alone there, Alex. It makes me think about the idea of the mnemonics of memory palaces and whether visions of architectural spaces might have aided people in the recall and transmission of oral stories.
Yes. So you're making a direct connection between memory, architectural space, moving through architectural space, that is then generating storytelling. So if you imagine it's one genre of the art of memory in which you construct by using a very familiar space. It can be a kind of palace, it can be your home, it can be a city, but it has to be familiar, and you have to be able to imagine yourself walking through various spaces, opening, closing doors, and seeing things in those spaces, and that journey generates the successive narrative of a story you're telling, which is it's originally the ancient word for orators, or to remember long speeches, but I think also sermons, long sermons during the Middle Ages were part of this practice by preachers, and we know that jurists had to develop memory techniques too, because they had to carry the entire corpus of Roman law in their head, because there weren't copies that you could carry around, because they're also rather large, so they were different techniques. And so, yes, this is, and thank you for bringing this up again, because this makes perfect sense in terms of how Boccaccio, as someone who would have been very much schooled in the rhetorical arts, is constructing for his own work an explicit architectural or architectonic monument that externalizes that interior architecture of the mind into a text in which people see that structure. We know that the readers, that they were fascinated by these framing narratives of the Decameron, and that by externalizing it, it's sort of the way, maybe sort of the way in which print culture has been understood as an externalization, right, of manuscript culture, so that remembering could be, the bulk of remembering could be actually put into databases that we used to call books, and that are now externalized into other forms as well, so that the work of memory is preserved without the person remembering. So I think that connects really nicely. Thank you, for the way in which I conceive of the monumental architectonic structure of the Decameron as something that is sort of preserving something that was originally designed within the head, say, if you took them for
Wonderful, thank you. I think looks so, yeah, so sorry, I'm just keeping an eye on the chat and also on the ask a question box. And oh, we got one more. Okay, and from Michael Gieder. I wonder whether animals or birds were allowed to traverse architectural spaces via doors or windows, or whether they were employed as messengers beyond vectors of disease.
Okay, I got the first part. Can you read just again so I make sure I understand?
Yeah, of course. I wonder whether animals or birds were allowed to traverse architectural spaces via doors or windows, and whether they were employed as messengers beyond vectors of disease.
Wow, okay, the second part I'm not completely sure about. But of course, there are instances, literary and biblical instances, right, of birds providing these kinds of messaging systems, definitely. Especially since the higher flying birds were closer to the divine, for example. There's also a vertical axis, right, versus the horizontal axis across which the birds fly. Yes, there are, and I'm actually just finishing a dissertation in which the writer talks about the constant problem in the Middle Ages from what we would call public works administration, complaints about dogs in churches, especially. So dogs are constantly running in and out of churches, disrupting things, and sort of and then destroying the moralized space that they're trying to maintain in there through the singing of songs and the mass. So that happens constantly. There is jumping in through windows. I think I've got specific examples, but there are constant regulations against goats and pigs and cows, which of course are the animals being slaughtered daily for human consumption, and so they have a particular kind of or generate a kind of particular urban anxiety about being in public spaces, and so the regulations against how they can be housed, where they can be installed, is a constant source of urban negotiation. Birds are today, and were then too, also enclosed within their own architectural space, so that the sounds they produced would continue to beautify the soundscape. And there are some funny stories about that I'm vaguely remembering about birds let into interior spaces, which of course creates havoc constantly, and extreme panic as well. So yes, that's all I can give you at the moment for examples of that. There was a constant interaction, I think, between like domesticated feed animals and work animals, and of course their excrement too, right? This is part of the problem. And in fact, in this dissertation I'm writing, it's very interesting that the magistracy, the short-term name of the magistrate in charge of keeping streets clean is called the Fandro, right? Or the mud or filth institute, and they are constantly accusing people of leaving dung in the wrong places, or leaving dung too long in the right places, or throwing dung on their neighbors' places too. So that, of course, indexical relationship to animal presence is also there constantly too.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm also, I don't have a question here, but I'm thinking about the relationship between the fabulous tradition of storytelling and perhaps, another sort of dimension in terms of thinking about animals. We have a follow-on question from Elspeth Graham, who is also the LJMU parish, so hello. I was going to ask about internal external environments too. External spaces in the wonderful slides, and actually I think we need to really celebrate also the amazing PowerPoint that Niall put together. It was really outstanding and visually stunning. Yes, so sorry. External spaces in the wonderful slides, e.g. windows as doors, and your final slide with a horsewoman on trotting horse. So do plants and animals create any particular relationship between external spaces and architectural ones?
Did animals create any relationships between external spaces and architectural spaces?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I'm glad you pointed out the exterior scenes, because of course there you are in a different kind of architectural space. You're what we call landscape architecture. So these are spaces that are designed, of course, and in the, if you've and I have to say, when I first began reading the Cameron, I mean, the framing narratives, when the Begata, they talk about the day, they got, they would lounge over breakfast for several hours, and then they sing songs together, they do other decorative things, and they walk in the garden and they listen to the birds. And so there's lots of sort of sounds that are coincident with the idea of an idealized garden or locus dominus, for example. Which I think are part of the counter or contrast to some terrifying sounds and screeching noises that often happen in the stories themselves. So there are animals are part of that. And you mentioned the horses. I mean, there are horses. I think the evidence of them were installed inside the city, but there are, of course, regulations about when and who can ride horses. And horses, I think, are connected to other kinds of brigata or brigades of males ritually kidnapping women from their familial home and bringing to the male groom's familial home across the city. And that is one of the few instances, I think, where young men are sort of allowed to ride in brigades, because riding a bunch of young men riding horses causes a source of anxiety too, because they were up to no good, of course. And it gave them a different kind of masculine identity. And it also, I mean, there are several stories, and I believe, they're in the Decameron. A while since I read these ones, but there's one I remember in particular where the potential lover is strutting around on a horse underneath the window of the woman. So there's a different kind of mounted movement, which has a different kind of meaning than, say, walking, or that create a different kind of relationship. And of course, mounted men can see into windows that unmounted men might not be able to, for example. So I'm thinking, I'm thinking of your question as I'm trying to answer it at the same time. I think it's important because riding horses is very much a class-based identity issue at this moment. So these are relatively wealthy youths, 3 women, 10, 7 men, who are in the hills around Florence that come back in their brigade. Except that their brigade is only a decorous one and is not, at least in the text, is not explicitly identified as one in which there is sexual desire, but implicitly within that, that comes up all the time.
Thank you. I'm also now thinking about the relationship between, and this is something which Alphonse knows a lot more about than me, about the relationship between horsemanship and these kinds of spaces. But yeah, we have another question from Heather Smith, and I think this should probably be our last because we're already running a little over time. But it's just testament to... Oh no, not at all. It's testament to just how wonderful and rich your paper is. And so Heather Smith asks, it strikes me how in both the 2 strategies you pointed to in the Decameron, between blocking out sound and using raucous sound as a barrier itself, there is the underlying concept of sound as having the capacity to pollute space, which we can see in examples like the Compi revolts with the bells. I wonder how connected these strategies might have been to social class and having privilege of access to isolated spaces.
Yeah. Yes, quite possibly. Yes, I think definitely, because obviously there would have been those people who could not close themselves up in spaces. But Boccaccio does talk about servants, right, who are there are complaints about servants who are just sort of waiting for their masters to die, so they are in the household with them, but they're not participating in this kind of this acoustic defensive mechanism. At least they're not in the narrative. And so because they're sort of just accessories to that. So yes, definitely class-based in ways in which a family that is so identified with their palace properties becomes very explicit in ways in which governments attempt to discipline large families, like the famous story of the Uberti clan, who defied the tax collectors and killed government representatives, and then the complete destruction of their central properties in Florence that then became part of the piazza in front of the town hall there. And so that identification between architecture, the domestic architecture of the palace and the family itself, therefore that they are the ones who, by closing themselves in, they're actually constructing a barrier, right, to the polluting sounds around themselves. So they're actually sort of fusing themselves with the architectural protection that they're supposed to have. And so I think it's a very much a very blurred line between where those boundaries are between bodies and buildings in that case. In the other case, you have the dissolution of architecture comes from the fact that the presence of the families is no longer there. So those walls in the first case are being manipulated to become completely closed. And in the second case, they have been abandoned, so they just can't function without the families in them, right? So so the people, the idea is that the people then who are inhabiting them and yelling and screaming would have either given up, right? What defines them as a kind of a wealthy, decorous class, or were simply uninterested in the boundaries between classes, in the ways in which servants just basically sometimes took over properties, and there's a kind of real anxiety about the death of some families and the way in which they're just sort of immersed once all those social structures, like the palace, that fall down at this moment, exposing people and the sort of the arbitrariness of class differences. I think he's getting at there. Because in the middle way between those two extreme reactions to the play, which is which I can't help thinking about. Someone pointed this out when I was discussing this in a similar venue, where it was very not unlike the way in which American Democrats and Republicans have responded to the plague in the past 2.5 years, right? With reckless abandon and with terrified, reclusiveness, for example. I think extremes. And so in the middle is the Begata. In the middle are those who maintain somehow by going to the abandoned countryside villas. So those that have been abandoned too and were in danger of falling apart, but are inhabited now by 10 young men and women who attempt to maintain their class identity and their social decorousness or decorum by wandering through like those gardens, by inhabiting that architecture, by eating the food that was prepared and left on the table when the family just suddenly died. By inhabiting that, they're able to, I think, maintain as a kind of government in exile from Florence, to maintain the kind of social those social structures in the absence of a city that could define them, which they, I guess, by getting on their horses and going back to the city at the end, they're bringing that back with them. So the middle road, of course, is what Boccaccio is pointing to, the probable response, I think, right? That you have to, so you have to leave, but you can't abandon. And you have to maintain architectural spaces for the integrity of your identity, but you do it in kind of exile, always with the intent of returning, because that would be too extreme. But you can't sort of stay and be in denial about what's going on by abandoning. In the first instance, by abandoning everyone else in the cities. You can't abandon the city physically, and you can't abandon the city socially. You have to sort of put it on hold for a moment and then sort of bring it back at the end. That's how I'm reading it as an architectural. Yeah.
And I loved one of the examples that you gave in, I think one of the examples towards the end where they're taking the mice off and shaking off the cobwebs. So there's a very kind of visceral and that very much kind of the sense of the connection between the body of the building and the body that it's protecting.
Yes, that's a nice. Yeah, that's a very nice I think analogy or connection there, because you have what is in fact a kind of wasted, unused energy in both cases, because of the dysfunction of a government that, in the face of certain potential violence, simply closes itself up again, jumps into a cupboard, and then of course the cobwebs and the mice that sit in the helmet and the armor, of course, means that they've never really taken up their position as defenders of the people of Florence. And of course, this is very typical critique, because the executory of justice and the Capitano di Popolo, captain of the people, and the Podesta were all foreign officials, right, who were paid to take care of Florentines and maintain their fractious factionalism, and so there's just a jab at them being linked in the movies there for sure. And again, as you say, a bodily architectural metaphor, or an integrated bodily architectural metaphor, which is fascinating. So thank you for that as well.
Wonderful, well, thank you. And I think this is probably the time that we should really sort of come to a close, but thank you not only for your really rich and stimulating paper and the really beautiful visually, it really was stunning PowerPoint, but also for battling so bravely with the computer gremlins that wanted to thwart this session. It's never easy delivering online, I think, compared to delivering in person, particularly when you're sort of talking in a disembodied way to an audience which you can't see. But then to have the technology decide to misbehave as well, it's really wonderful to kind of see the way that you kept going. And yeah, I just really loved the whole discussion about the cultural meaning of sound and architecture, the way that sound moves in and out, the voice of the narrator in relation to storytelling. I'm going to be thinking about a lot of the points that you were making for a long time. And yes, as you can see, the note, well, you can't see, but the notes I've taken are absolutely copious. And I'm sure that all our auditors are the same. So if in the chat you'd like to thank Neil, I will clap on all of our behalves, and then I'll end this broadcast.
Thank you very much, Rick. It's my pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.